right, so in this lecture, we're going to focus on chemical bonds. So, electrons, we talked about in the previous lecture how protons, neutrons, and electrons compose atoms, and how the protons and neutrons were in the nucleus, but electrons were sort of outside the nucleus in this electron cloud. Now, technically, the electrons are located in these different levels called shells. And we're going to simplify this some because remember, our focus is how do the chemicals of life relate to living things. In a chemistry class, you would spend a lot more time on this and learn about exceptions and a lot more details. So all of the electrons in the atom are important, but the ones that are going to be most important for us are going to be the ones in the outermost shell. And this is sometimes called the valence shell. So you see here how it says an atom whose outer shell is not full tends to interact with other atoms and either gain, lose, or share electrons. And it forms what are called chemical bonds. So those outer electrons are also called the valence electrons. And so we're going to look at the next couple of slides, and I'm going to show you the valence electrons for some of these different elements, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon, and talk about how they might bond with other things to fill up that outer shell. So let's look at carbon first. Now, all atoms in their first shell can hold 2 electrons. So you can see here in this carbon atom, this is the nucleus, and then this is the first shell, and it has 2 electrons, and that's actually full. But we don't really care about those electrons for what we're talking about. We sometimes call the electrons that are not in the outer shell core electrons, and they're really not involved in chemical reactions. So how many electrons does something want to have? Well, if we're talking about any of the shells after the first one, which only holds 2, all the other shells want to have 8. So if we look at carbon, this is its outer shell, and notice it has only 4, not 8. Now, to get 8, atoms will do one of 3 things. They'll either gain electrons, lose electrons, or share electrons. And they're going to do whatever's going to get them to 8 the fastest, right? So if it has 7 and it only needs 1 more, it's probably going to gain an electron. It would be easier to gain 1 than to lose 7. On the other hand, if it only had 1 electron in its outer shell, it might be easier to get rid of it because the shell underneath would already be full. But carbon has exactly 4. It's not going to be really easy to gain 4 or lose 4. So what it's more likely to do is to share. Meaning what it can do is it can hook up with other atoms and share, take one of theirs and share it, something like this. And now, instead of having 4, there's not a lot of space here, this carbon will now have 8. And these 4 atoms, which could be other things, could be hydrogens, could be things like that. So by making 4 bonds, it now is sharing these 4 additional electrons, and it gives it 8 in its outermost shell. So they all want to have 8, and in order to get 8, carbon would be very likely to share. Now, carbon on the table is over here. This is not the whole table. It turns out, this is a good time to mention, that the way that the periodic table is arranged, it is in order of increasing atomic number. So you'll see 1, and then number 2 is missing over here on the right, and then 3, 4, and then 5, 6. But why are they in these weird rows? Like, why is hydrogen on top of lithium? You know, why did they decide to stack these in the same group on top of each other? And the answer is that all the elements in the same group have the same number of valence electrons. Everything in this first column has exactly 1. Everything in this column has 2. Now these are called transition metals, and we actually are not going to talk much about them in biology. You'll learn more in chemistry. But skipping over here to these elements, everything in this one has 3. Everyone in this column or group has 4. There's carbon, so another one with 4 would be silicon right under carbon. And it keeps going up to 8. I'll have to get another table on a different page to show you the full thing. But if they have the same number of valence electrons, they're going to tend to behave the same way. So everything in column 1 they all behave very similarly to each other because they all have one valence electron. In fact, what most of them tend to do is get rid of that one electron and their shell underneath is full. But let me show you, let's move on. So the driving question asked about how many bonds something would form. So this is a little section of the periodic table. So this is actually, these are all in the same group. And notice what I was saying, they all have one valence electron. Sodium, lithium, and hydrogen, one valence electron. They will all tend to form one bond. Why would they form one bond? Well, because in this case, the easiest thing to do would be to get rid of that valence electron. And then their shell beneath is already full. See how if hydrogen gets rid of its electron, it actually doesn't have any. If lithium gets rid of the electron, the shell beneath is full. It's got two, which is all that the first shell can hold. If sodium gets rid of that outermost electron, the shell beneath already has 8 electrons. The ones in group 2, they all have 2 valence electrons. They will actually tend to form 2 bonds. What they will actually usually do is get rid of those 2 outside electrons, and then the shell underneath will be full. So by getting rid of these 2 electrons, the shell underneath already has 8 electrons. This one, the shell underneath already has 2 because it's just the one shell. The ones in group 3 have 3 valence electrons. They will actually tend to form 3 bonds. A lot of times what they will tend to do is get rid of those 3 electrons, give them away when they bond with something, and then the shell underneath is already full. Now if we skip, this is where in the periodic table the transition elements were. It actually looks more like this. There would have been the first 2 columns, then this, and we sort of skipped all of those, and now we're over here looking at carbon. So they've skipped a few things here. So carbon, you can see, has 4 valence electrons. We already talked about this one. It will tend to form 4 bonds because by forming 4 bonds, it will tend to share with other things. It can share and end up with 8 electrons. And now it gets a little weird because you're like, oh, I get it. Okay, so nitrogen has 5 electrons. It must want to form 5 bonds. No, it doesn't work like that. The easiest way for it to get to 8 would be to actually just get 3 more electrons. It doesn't want to get 5. See, once we pass carbon, these are going to tend to gain electrons, but the ones over here tended to lose electrons. So beryllium, going back for a second, it had 2 electrons in the outer shell. It's not going to form 6 bonds so that it has 8 electrons in the outer shell. What it'll actually do is get rid of these 2 electrons and form 2 bonds, ionic bonds, a particular type of bond. So what nitrogen will tend to do is it'll tend to gain 3 electrons. Then it would have 8. It has 5. It needs 3 more to have 8. So it would actually tend to make 3 bonds. Kind of the same way boron makes 3 bonds, but they'll be a different kind of bond. Oxygen has 6. It only needs 2 more to have 8, so it will tend to make 2 bonds. And then it will have 8. Fluorine has 7, so it only needs 1 more to have 8. It will tend to make 1 bond. And these are our noble gases. They already have a full outer shell, so they don't make any bonds. They tend to be inert or inactive. And so helium already has 2. It's the first shell, so that's full. Neon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's full. Argon, it's also full. You'll notice that as we go down these rows or periods on the table, we get another shell. See how this first row, 1 shell. Second row, wow, 2 shells. Everything. Third row, everything has 3 shells. And if you were to keep going, the 4th row, everything would have 4 shells. But the outer one is always going to be the valence shell. And the next element here, instead of having 3 shells, it would have 4 shells. But the one on the very outside, the valence one, would still only have 1 electron, just like everything above it. It's a lot of information. This is just the same pictures close up again. So again, everything here, 1 valence electron. Everything in the second column, 2. This they've skipped. There's a gap here. Oh, I'm sorry, not here. The gap is over here. Everything here, 3. They then skipped this big gap. Let me see if I have one of the whole table. No, I guess not. All right, so let's talk about different kinds of bonds. So we were talking about how many bonds something would make. So it wants to make enough bonds to get 8, either by gaining electrons, losing electrons, or sharing electrons. So there's 2 basic kinds of bonds. There's ionic bonds and covalent bonds. So covalent bonds are always formed when atoms share electrons. But just because they share doesn't mean they share evenly. So there's covalent bonds can sort of be subdivided into non-polar covalent bonds and polar covalent bonds. So what happens is, if the 2 things are sharing electrons and they both sort of pull equally on the electrons, they both want some electrons, so the electrons are sort of traveling around both of them the same, that's going to be called a non-polar covalent bond. For example, oxygen, when it binds to another oxygen to make O2, neither one of those oxygens is going to pull harder on the electrons. They're going to be shared perfectly between the 2 oxygens. So this is going to be called a non-polar covalent bond. So what's a polar covalent bond? Well, sometimes, for example, in water, even though the electrons are shared, so this is what water looks like, H2O. Even though the electrons are being shared, what actually ends up happening is oxygen is more, the word is electronegative. What that means is it pulls harder on the electrons than the hydrogen does. So it's sort of like if I share a candy bar with you, but instead of giving you half, I only give you 1/3 of the candy bar. So I shared with you, but I didn't really share evenly. That's sort of what's happening here. If the electrons are like the candy bar, they're hanging around the oxygen more than they're hanging around the hydrogens. And the oxygen ends up slightly, they use this little symbol for partial, slightly negative, and the 2 hydrogens both end up slightly positive, because remember, electrons are negative. So if the electrons themselves are hanging around the oxygen is going to end up slightly negative. And that is called a polar covalent compound, because even though the electrons are being shared, they're not being shared evenly, and so you're ending up with slight charges. You learn a lot more about this in chemistry. We're really scraping the surface here. So why are the bonds polar covalent in water? Again, the reason why is because oxygen has a high electronegativity. It pulls very hard on electrons. Hydrogens are very tiny. And so they don't really hold on to the electrons as well. So the oxygen really doesn't steal the electrons. They're still sharing, but they're sort of hanging around the oxygen more. So that's a polar covalent bond. These are just some pictures. Whenever they show a covalent bond in a picture, you'll see they oftentimes will show them like this. See how they're showing that both of these are shared? Here's oxygen. They're sharing 2 pairs of electrons. Here's carbon sharing electrons with hydrogen. And here's water, where oxygen is sharing electrons with hydrogen. Now, remember how I said everybody wants, other than hydrogen, hydrogen just wants 2 electrons. So does this hydrogen have 2 electrons when it's bonded to another hydrogen? Yes, it does, because if they're shared, they count for both of them. So this hydrogen has 2, just like it wants. This one has 2, just like it wants. Now, what did oxygen want? Oxygen wanted 8, right? So let's look at how many are shared. So if we just look at this oxygen, it has 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, I'm only counting the outer shell. And then these are the shared one, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this one has 8. What about the other oxygen? 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the shared ones count for both of them. So 5, 6, 7, 8. They both have 8. What about carbon here? Well, by sharing with the hydrogen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the carbon now has 8. So the goal for anything except for the hydrogen or helium, those are the only 2 elements that only want 2 in their outer shell, the goal is to have 8. And in all of these covalent bonds, they're sharing. Okay, and then really quick, let me skip this animation. So here's our periodic table again. So again, everything here has 1 valence electron. These all have 2. Skipping the middle, these all have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, except for helium. It only has 2. So that's how many valence electrons it currently has, and then it'll either gain, lose, or share to get 8. So if it only has 1, it may get rid of that 1 and form a bond, but that's not going to be sharing. So that's called an ionic bond. So if an electron is handed from one thing to another, that's not a covalent bond, that's an ionic bond. And we'll pick up with that.